So tonight we are talking about Sam Bellamy and Goody Hallett. I'm sure most of you have heard of both of those people before, and so I hope you'll forgive me if I repeat any information that you already know. My hope is that you'll all leave this building with a little bit more knowledge, or maybe an interest if you previously, for some reason, thought that pirates and witches were boring. I can convince you that they're very, very interesting. Okay, next slide. What you see on the left is Goody Hallett. She is our very own witch of Eastham, or witch of Wellfleet if you live in Wellfleet and you want to claim her for yourself. She is a character who probably actually existed. It's a little unclear. But the legend goes that there was a beautiful young woman who lived in Eastham, or Wellfleet, in the early part of the 18th century. She supposedly worked at a tavern somewhere in Eastham, or Wellfleet. This is kind of a theme that you will find. And that tavern could be the Higgins Tavern here in Eastham, could be one of two Crosby Taverns here in Eastham, could even be the tavern on Great Island in Wellfleet. Anyway, she's at the tavern when one night in 1715, a bunch of sailors come to the tavern because they've had to dock in a storm. And one of those sailors is a British man by the name of Sam Bellamy, who is someone that I think most of us have heard of, is a very famous pirate. The legend goes that as Sam Bellamy is eating at the tavern, he looks out the window and he sees Goody Hallett standing underneath an apple tree. He goes out to meet her. The two fall in love right away. This is the legend. We're not sure if this is how it actually happened. If you ask the author of this very famous, great old book of Cape Cod folklore called The Narrow Land, the two of them do more than just meet under that tree. According to that author, Bellamy makes, quote, sailorman love to her. Anyway, the two of them, they have their tryst. They fall in love, and then soon after, Sam Bellamy leaves to go to sea to seek his fortune as a treasure hunter and later a pirate. Goody Hallett is stuck here in Eastham, and she is not only stuck here in Eastham, she's stuck with his child. And as time goes on, the legend goes, she gives birth to the child, gets chased out of town, lives on the dunes in Wellfleet for a little while, and then eventually dies. Once again, we're not sure how much of this really happened, but if we go to the next slide, I'd like to read from you a small bit about Goody Hallett so we can see how this woman is remembered by folklorists. This is from a book called 1812, A Tale of Cape Cod. This is one of many historical fiction folklore books. This was written by Michael Fitzgerald for the 100th anniversary of the War of 1812. If you thought you were going here to a presentation by me and you were not going to get some ghost stories, I'm really sorry. Goody Hallett lived alone. She was old, and most people regarded her as a witch, but this was probably because she kept much to herself. She was expert at the spinning wheel and ostensibly supported herself by this industry. She never asked charity, though people wondered how so old a woman could earn enough to keep her from want. She courted seclusion, and the situation of her small dwelling, far removed from the prying eyes of neighbors, favored this. A tall, thin woman with dark features strongly telling of Indian blood, her appearance went far to confirm the idea that she rode the broomstick and could work charms. She was not a native of this place. It was said she belonged to a distant part of the Cape, beyond Yarmouth, and she arrived in Eastham soon after the widow. Beyond Yarmouth. Yeah. Pretty far. Next slide. Yeah. Next slide. Yeah, okay, so let's get some context here. That guy over there is Cotton Mather. He's going to be an important character in this story. He was considered by a lot of historians to be the first American evangelical. He's a big fire and brimstone preacher who believes in witchcraft and writes lots and lots of books and pamphlets on the subject. These pamphlets are very widely distributed. And he is blamed in part for the Salem witchcraft hysteria, which was in the late 17th century. Just as that hysteria was ending, he published a book called The Wonders of the Invisible World, where he essentially defends his role in the witch hysteria. He says, yeah, there were totally witches here, and it's a really good thing that we were hanging them. And in that book, he associates Native Americans with witches and the devil, which is part of why we get this idea of Goody Hallett's supposed complexion establishing her as a witch. Next slide. As to who Goody Hallett was, I think the most likely explanation is she was this woman named Mehetable Brown. So, Goody, if you don't know, this is not a real first name, it's a title. It's a little like Mrs. So when these stories talk about Goody Hallett, they're not talking about someone literally named Goody Hallett. They're talking about someone whose last name is Hallett. So there was definitely a woman named Mehetable Brown. There were actually 2 or 3 Mehetable Browns who were living in Eastham around the turn of the 17th, 18th centuries. So she would have been born in Eastham between 1690 and 1700, or there's also one who was born in Salem in 1698, which I think is an interesting little connection to the Salem witch trials. Perhaps that's the source of the legend of Goody Hallett being a witch, if indeed Goody Hallett is the Mehetable Brown who was born in Salem. Anyway, Mehetable Brown married a sailor named John Hallett in 1715, earning herself the surname Hallett. And then in 1716, according to the historical record, John Hallett remarries. Now, usually that would happen because maybe Mehetable died in childbirth or just died in general. We know that she was pregnant at the time, if this was the same Goody Hallett. But there is no record of her death. So it's thought by some that perhaps instead of simply dying, Mehetable Brown actually married someone else. She remarried. Maybe she left John Hallett for Sam Bellamy. So Mehetable Brown is related to John Knowles, who is a man whose barn Goody Hallett supposedly hid her child in, according to the legend. And she may also be connected to the Great Island Tavern because Lydia Brown, a relative of Mehetable Brown, by the historical record, her children sold a parcel of land on Great Island to someone named Samuel Smith in 1743. So all that is to say, who is Goody Hallett? Did she exist? Maybe. If she existed, it's very likely her name was Mehetable Brown. All right, next slide. Here's someone we know existed. This is Black Sam Bellamy. He is one of the most famous pirates in history, and according to an article in Forbes, I believe it was the online version of Forbes, so not Forbes magazine, but Forbes website, he was the wealthiest pirate in history when you adjust his wealth for inflation. He was worth $175.3 million, which is quite a lot. So he was born in England in 1689, probably either in Devon or London. And he joined the Royal Navy at a pretty young age. He came to Cape Cod around 1715. Some people say he did it to visit relatives. Others say that he washed ashore after a storm at sea, and he was like going to Boston, but he came to Cape Cod instead because of the storm. Anyway, he is sometimes called Black Sam Bellamy because he had long black hair, but what's important is that there are no actual contemporary records from his time of people calling him Black Sam Bellamy, so it's likely that that was a later invention. By the way, I know that I talk really fast, so if I'm ever going too fast, please just like wave at me and I will say thank you. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So Black Sam Bellamy was sailing the seas at an era when the Spanish were really like the most powerful or most important group who were sailing. What we see here is a map of Spanish and Portuguese trade routes. The white ones are the Spanish routes. So the Spanish were the first ones to make an cross-Atlantic trade route, and that's what you see right here. And I think it's important that we understand that the Spanish are doing this because they are going to be the motivation for a lot of what Sam Bellamy does throughout his pirate and naval career. Next slide. So Spain at this time, we're going to delve into some Spanish history. They needed some treasure because they were fighting the War of the Spanish Succession. Here's how that goes. Charles II of Spain died at the beginning of the war. He died childless. He had no direct heir. It was not immediately clear who should succeed him. Generally, there were 2 camps. The French believed it should be his great-nephew, Philip of Anjou, who was the one who Charles had named as his successor. Everyone else in Europe thought that it should be Charles of Austria. And here's why. Spain and France in this age were both very expansionist powers. They really wanted to take over more land, and if the 2 of them had joined forces, the way that they would have if Philip of Anjou from France became the king of Spain, it was thought that the 2 of them would seriously upset the balance of power in Europe. So what we had was we had all the other European countries going to war in order to essentially stop Philip of Anjou from becoming the Spanish king. Next slide. Now he did become the Spanish king, but the war was really expensive for all sides. The British government had to withdraw from the war before it ended because it was so expensive. Now, if Sam Bellamy was fighting in naval battles for the British Empire, which it's believed he was, he would have been fighting against the Spanish here. The war ended between 1713 and 1715 when a series of treaties were signed that allowed Philip, the successor, to keep the throne of Spain, but he had to relinquish his claim to the French throne. So that way Spain and France didn't end up merging. Next slide. Now, how is Spain funding this war? As I said, wars are very expensive. Well, once the war was wrapping up, they realized that they could pay for it by getting a lot of treasure from the New World. So we had Spanish fleets sailing across the Atlantic to essentially take treasure from the New World and then ship it off to Spain to fund whatever the royal family was doing at the time. In 1715, this was a fleet sailing from Havana. It was actually two fleets. They're called the Spanish treasure fleets, or the 1715 treasure fleet. There were 12 ships there, plus one French ship that was forced to sail with them because the Spanish didn't want the French to snitch on them. Like, hey, we're carrying a ton of treasure across the ocean. They wanted the French to sail with them, so they didn't tell anyone else. I wrote down the names of the captains. I'm not even going to try to pronounce them. And yeah, they were mainly carrying gold and silver. Next slide. Now, so here's what was on the 1715 treasure fleet. There were 13,000 treasure chests and 3 million silver coins on one of those ships. So you can imagine on 12 of those, there is probably a lot of treasure. There's also gold bars, gold dust, tropical fruits, emeralds, pearls, porcelain from China, and 15 million pieces of eight. What I have here are pieces of eight. This is something I actually didn't know. When people talk about pirates, they talk a lot about pieces of eight. What I didn't know is the reason why they're called pieces of eight is because these Spanish coins were often cut up in order to make like parts of a coin. So you could cut it into 8 pieces. Here is 1/8 of a coin. Imagine like if we only had dollar coins and you wanted to pay for something with a quarter, you'd literally cut up your dollar coin and give someone a quarter of a dollar coin. Pretty interesting. Next slide. Okay, on July 31st, tragedy strikes. I'm sure that everyone could see where this is going when I mentioned ships carrying treasure. There is a hurricane that hits the fleet as it is sailing off the coast of Florida. There are about 2,500 people on the fleet. 1,000 of them die immediately. The other 1,500 have to survive on shore in Florida, which is a pretty hard place to survive. The ships get wrecked miles apart, and there's disease, snakes, lack of medical supplies, etc. The French ship actually escapes, and they reach France on August 31st, unaware that the Spanish have sunk. But now we have, in 1715, off the coast of Florida, what was it? Can you go back to the previous slide? We have 15 million pieces of eight off the coast of Florida, and that obviously attracts treasure hunters. All right, next one. Great. How are things salvaged in this time before submarines? So this is really interesting to me. There are, they would have diving suits like that. What you're looking at is an early 18th century diving suit. And you can see here there's like kind of a tube, and that's how air would be fed to that. If you look really closely down here, probably only the people in the front row can see it, but there's actually a man wearing that suit walking around on the ocean floor with his air tube connecting to this, which is called a diving bell. So the diving bell is essentially a big half sphere that would be dropped down from a ship, and it would capture air at the top. So people could ride down in the diving bell and actually be able to breathe a little bit as they're on the seafloor. Someone would put on the suit, then they would duck out of the diving bell and walk around on the seafloor picking up treasure, and usually they would like tie it to an anchor or something that would then be hauled back up. Does this make sense for how people would salvage from these ships? Yeah, so this was a whole industry in the early 18th century, it's salvaging from ships. Next slide. Even crazier, sometimes they would actually have people diving for it. Now most of the time these people were slaves, so it's not quite as cool that they're doing it this way, but these guys could hold their breath for like 3 minutes, and they would train themselves to be able to see better underwater. Yeah, they would have slaves literally swim to the bottom of the ocean, tie ropes to the treasure they found, and then swim back up. So yeah, lots of ways to salvage things. Okay, so that's what Sam Bellamy decides he's going to do. By the time the news reaches Cape Cod that the treasure fleet, the Spanish treasure fleet, has sunk, draggers have already combed the seafloor for a lot of the Spanish treasure. And by October of 1715, just a couple months after the fleet sinks, 5,000 pieces of eight have been, or 5 million pieces of eight have been recovered. That's a third of the treasure. In January 1716, some pirates start trying to get this treasure, specifically Henry Jennings and John Wills. They're working on behalf of the governor of Jamaica. And they're attacking the Spanish salvagers, and they steal 12,000 of those pieces of eight. Early in 1716, Bellamy himself sets sail for Florida with a wealthy Bostonian named Palsgrave Williams. And they're chased away by the Spanish military when they make it to Florida, but what's important to know is that Sam Bellamy wanted to seek his fortune, and he is doing so by attempting to salvage from the sunken Spanish treasure fleet. Something that I want to kind of clarify here that I realize people might not know is that pirates weren't always entirely self-serving. They could very often have been working for a government, pillaging the ships and the camps of that government's political enemies. So as we see here, Henry Jennings and John Wills, they work on behalf of the governor of Jamaica. Later on, we're going to meet a pirate who works on behalf of the English. Next slide. Okay, so when Bellamy and Williams get chased away from the treasure fleet by the Spanish military, they decide that instead of trying to salvage, they're just going to become pirates. So they sell their ship that they sailed from Cape Cod on, and they trade it for 2 periaglas, which is what you're looking at here. These are much more nimble ships that are good for following larger vessels. In April, he actually joins Henry Jennings' fleet. Henry Jennings was one of those pirates who was working on behalf of the Jamaican government. And this coalition of pirates, they worked together to attack a French merchant ship called Saint Marie in Cuba. And Henry Jennings actually puts Bellamy and Williams in charge of the attack. This is Sam Bellamy's first attack as a pirate, as far as we know. And it's a very unorthodox one. So what Sam Bellamy does during this attack on the Saint Marie in Cuba is he and his crew all strip naked, and they're only wearing the ammunition for their guns, and they're holding their guns and their swords, and they just yell at the people as they're chasing them down, and this seems to work. It's an intimidation technique. I think that when we think of it now, we think of, okay, someone strips naked, that seems like they're more vulnerable, but I guess that it just showed how confident Sam Bellamy and his crew were in what they could do. Yeah, so they declare no quarter, and meanwhile Jennings is a ways back firing cannons to help intimidate this French merchant ship. And they take the ship. Jennings tortures the French merchants into revealing the location of onshore treasure. And then he sends his men to attack another French merchant ship that he hears about called Marianne, leaving Sam Bellamy and Palsgrave Williams behind with the Saint Marie. This is important. Next. Okay, I have Benjamin Hornigold here, but in the interest of continuity, I want to tell you what Sam Bellamy and Palsgrave Williams are doing while Henry Jennings is off looking for the Marianne. So while Jennings is away, Bellamy and Williams decide that they want to double-cross Henry Jennings. And they decide to actually steal the treasure from the Saint Marie and escape in one of their 2 periaglas. So it's really crazy. Sam Bellamy is what seems to be his first operation as a pirate. He right away betrays the guy who sent him on that operation, which is it once again shows that he meant business as a pirate. And so meanwhile, Henry Jennings is chasing the Marianne. He meets this guy Benjamin Hornigold. He is our English pirate who usually works on behalf of the English crown. He mostly attacked merchant ships, specifically those belonging to the Spanish, and he has already captured the Marianne. By the time that Henry Jennings returns from fighting with Benjamin Hornigold, he sees that Bellamy has already taken his treasure and fled, and so he destroys Bellamy's remaining ship, but Bellamy is already long gone on his periagua. This is making sense? Not confusing? Okay, next slide. Okay, and so Benjamin Hornigold is so impressed with what Bellamy has done that he invites Bellamy to join his crew. And Bellamy and Williams do. And they join what is called the Republic of Pirates. So Benjamin Hornigold had his base of operations in the Bahamas. It was a haven for pirates and a haven for traders who were willing to sell to pirates. There were not that many non-pirates living there because the pirates were pretty violent and unpleasant to have as neighbors. But anyway, Bellamy and Williams joined Hornigold's crew. Hornigold gave Bellamy the Marianne, which, as you'll remember, is the ship that Henry Jennings wanted. And after Henry Jennings failed to get it, and Bellamy stole Jennings' treasure, Bellamy also ends up with the Marianne. So Bellamy is doing pretty well for himself. And in August of 1716, Hornigold's crew actually decide that they like Bellamy so much that they vote him in as the new captain instead of Benjamin Hornigold. And they leave Benjamin Hornigold like a boat to escape on, but Bellamy becomes the captain of this crew that used to serve under Benjamin Hornigold. This is something kind of interesting about pirates at this time that I think is pretty commonly known, but it might not be, is that piracy was a pretty democratic society. Everyone had an equal vote, didn't matter the color of your skin, didn't matter how you got into being a pirate, but everyone had an equal vote, and Bellamy was especially hard on this. He also gave everyone an equal share of the treasure when he pillaged treasure. And the crew really liked that about him, which is why they wanted him to be their captain. Next slide. One of Bellamy's crew members was John King, who was about 10 years old. He was sailing on a British sloop from Jamaica to Antigua, and Bellamy took the ship. And this was something that Bellamy would do whenever he took a ship. He would say, if anyone here wants to be a pirate, you can join my crew. If you don't want to be a pirate, you better move. And one of these guys, a 10-year-old kid, who said, oh my gosh, I'd love to be a pirate. And Bellamy said, great, you're on the crew. Now, his mother, as you can imagine, was not thrilled. But John King, he threatened to kill himself or hurt his mother if he was not allowed to join. And so he was allowed to join. And he remained in Bellamy's crew for the rest of his life, which unfortunately was not very long, because if we know the legend of Bellamy, we know that he sank a couple months later. Next slide. Okay, so in December of 1716, Sam Bellamy and his crew capture two ships, the Pearl and the Sultana, near the Virgin Islands. And Bellamy gives the Marianne to Palsgrave Williams, his companion, and Bellamy takes the Sultana for himself. Yes, I already said that he's known for dividing treasure evenly. Next slide. Okay, this is from an excellent, excellent book called A General History of the Pirates, written in 1724 by a man named Charles Johnson. This appears to be a pen name for someone who was either maybe a pirate on some crew or just a researcher who did a lot of research into pirates. Anyway, he attributes this very long and excellent speech to Sam Bellamy while Sam Bellamy is raiding another ship. And I'm going to read out the speech because I think it's very indicative of the kind of person that Bellamy is remembered as being. Now, Bellamy almost certainly did not actually say this. This is almost certainly fiction. But the fact that someone who was alive at the same time attributes this speech to Bellamy, I think gives us a good idea of the kind of person that he was, or the kind of person that his crew would have seen him as. So I'm going to speak as Bellamy, and I am boarding a ship that I want to plunder, and the person says, okay, why the hell are you doing this? You're a pirate, you're awful, you're stealing from like innocent people, what are you doing? And so this is Bellamy's response. You are a sneaking puppy, and so are all those who will submit to be governed by laws which rich men have made for their own security. For the cowardly whelps have not the courage otherwise to defend what they get by knavery, but damn ye altogether. Damn them for a pack of crafty rascals, and you who serve them for a parcel of hen-hearted numbskulls. They vilify us, the scoundrels do, when there is only this difference. They rob the poor under the cover of law, forsooth, and we plunder the rich under the protection of our own courage. Had you not better make then one of us than sneak after the arses of those villains for employment? So you can kind of see why Sam Bellamy is seen as the Robin Hood of pirates. And that's not modern construction. Even like very shortly after his death, he was seen as the Robin Hood of pirates. Next slide. Okay, in February 1717, he comes across the Goody Hallett, the most famous ship and the one that he will ultimately sink on. This was a heavily armed slave ship, commissioned in 1715 by a guy named Humphrey Maurice, who was the foremost London slave merchant of his day. You can see him right there. And so there were 3 days in which Sam Bellamy pursues the Goody Hallett, and eventually he does get it. When he gets the Widow, he gives the Sultana, which is the ship that he had been sailing, to Palsgrave Williams. No, that's wrong. He gives the Sultana to the captain of the Widow, who surrenders without a fight. And then Bellamy puts 10 more cannons on the Widow. Most of the Widow's passengers join Bellamy's crew. As you can imagine, if it is a slave ship, there's probably a fair amount of slaves on the ship, depending on where it's going. There might be slave traders instead, but there's probably a fair amount of slaves on the ship. And once again, pirate society is, generally speaking, more equal than non-pirate society, and so a lot of these people on the ship really like that idea. Next slide. What we see here is a drawing of an African port called Whydah. That's what the Whydah Galley is named after. It's named after a slave trading port in Africa called Whydah. Next slide. Okay, and then the last ship that Sam Bellamy ever steals is the Mary Ann. This happens in April 26th, 1717, just off the coast of Nantucket in Martha's Vineyard. So he is on his way north, seems to be on his way north to Maine, and he commandeers the Mary Ann. It's a smaller ship than the Widow, and so he leaves 3 of his crew members aboard the Mary Ann. He leaves 3 crew members of the Mary Ann aboard, because he knows that if he's going north to Maine, this is a very treacherous stretch of water. It's easy to get wrecked, and so he needs someone who knows the water well to guide him northward to Maine. And he sees the Mary Ann, he says, okay, you guys are based here, you guys know how to get north safely, and so I'm just going to force you guys to lead me north to Maine. And so he leaves 3 people aboard the Mary Ann to guide him north. Those are Thomas Fitzgerald, the first mate, James Donovan, the brother-in-law of the captain, and Alexander McConaughey, the cook. And he also puts 7 of his own pirates aboard the Mary Ann to make sure that these guys aren't double-crossing him. He takes the rest of the Mary Ann's crew, including the captain, aboard the Widow as his prisoners. And like I said, he knows he's going north, he needs someone who knows the waters to guide him, and he chooses the Mary Ann to be his guide. McConaughey, the cook, is the one who takes the helm of the Mary Ann, and he tries to steer the ship off course right away, afraid that Sam Bellamy is going to do something nefarious in Maine. He's probably correct. And then one of Bellamy's pirates threatens to shoot him in the head, so McConaughey decides, okay, I had better guide these guys, I better not mess with these guys. The pirates take from the ship's liquor supply. In some versions of the story, they start to fall asleep. That night it begins to storm. You may be asking, how do I know all this? Well, it turns out that not everyone died in that storm. Actually, everyone aboard the Mary Ann survived the wreck of the Widow. And so a lot of what we know about this, we know because these people testified in court about what it was like to be commandeered by Sam Bellamy. And so we do know that from these 3 people's own testimonies, that Sam Bellamy needed help getting north around Cape Cod, and that they knew that he was a pirate, they didn't want to work with him, and they tried to steer off course, and Sam Bellamy and his crew were wise to that. Next slide. Okay, let's check back in on Goody Hallett at this time. So Goody Hallett, as Sam Bellamy is sailing north around Cape Cod following the Mary Ann, Goody Hallett, the legend goes, is watching from the dunes of Wellfleet, wondering when her lover is going to return. So, according to the legend of Goody Hallett, after she was found to be pregnant with Sam Bellamy's child, she was chased out of town, and she ended up living in a little shack in the hills of Eastham or Wellfleet, from which she definitely could have seen the Widow and other ships passing by. Next slide. Now, at one point, the legend goes, Goody Hallett was also held in the old jail, which is what you see there. It was built in 1690. It's the oldest wooden jail in America. This would have been the jail that prisoners were brought to in Eastham. I believe now this is in Yarmouth? Barnstable? That was my second guess. And she would have been imprisoned there while Bellamy was away in Florida. Next slide. Okay, this is my favorite thing that's ever been written about Goody Hallett. This is from The Narrow Land. This is a 1934 book written by Elizabeth Reynard. This is fiction, but it is fiction based on folklore. And so this is an account of Goody Hallett in the old jail. We had a nice spooky flickering of the lights. That's exactly what it is. So Goody Hallett in this excerpt is sitting in the jail and wondering how and when she will be able to escape when she looks out the window and she sees a very handsome man approaching. And, okay. One of the iron cell bars stood between their faces. He reached out, took it lightly between his thumb and finger, and flicked it away, clean out of the window frame, as if it were no more than a stray bit of rye straw. Then he smiled and slowly shook his head. Ah, these stiff-necked, him-bellerin' Yankees! I tell you, sometimes they make me feel like the rawest greenie ever went on the account. The words meant nothing to Goody Hallett, but in the man's voice there was something smooth and westerly, something that taunted the spell. Now, my girl, he went on, flicking another bar of the window, I'm going to play ye fair and square across by your leave. You're young, but you showed old enough, sartain, for the employment I can get ye. You can forget all this, child. And with a gesture, he tossed away still another bar from the window. Your life's still before me. 'Tis all in the future. Yes, next slide. Soothingly, softly, he went on talking to her. But once he had led up to it properly, he made no bones about who he was. And as he spoke, from time to time, he punctuated his remarks by taking out the bars from the window, until all were gone and Goody Hallett's way to freedom lay clear. Also, the while he spoke, the girl felt bitter against those who had not let her die, and beguiled into vengeful thoughts, she listened and nodded. At last, he took a paper from his waistcoat. Can you write, Goody? Well, no matter. A mark's as good. Just put it there, where the line's broken into small grains. He touched a gold quill to his tongue, and as Goody took the quill, she observed that the tip glistened scarlet. She was about to make the mark when he caught her arm. Next slide. What tricks is it so soon? His eyes were suddenly like fiery drills, and his fingers bruised her. But after a moment, he smiled again. Young, I forget you're but a child, Goody Hallett. Go and make your mark, but if it's to be 2 lines, you'll oblige me to make them slantendicular like an X, not any other way. Goody understood. And that night she disappeared from Eastham jail, and before her case could come up in general court, the town of Eastham found that lock and bars could not hold Goody Hallett. Next slide. So that is the Narrowlands version of Goody Hallett's escape from the old jail, in which she is helped by the devil himself. And he makes a deal with her in which she becomes a witch. So, once again, remember, Goody Hallett is remembered as a witch, possibly because she was of Native American descent. And one of my favorite stories about Goody Hallett, I think my favorite folktale about her, is that as she is standing on the cliffs of Wellfleet overlooking the sea, she sees these ships sailing by, and she is so angry at Sam Bellamy for abandoning her here in Eastham with a child while he goes off to seek his fortune as a treasure hunter and a pirate. She's so angry at him that she uses her witchly magic to summon up a storm that will wreck Bellamy's ship against the coast, which is exactly what ends up happening. So, around 10:30 p.m., the Mary Ann wrecks off of Chatham. It wrecks on a small island that is no longer in existence. It has since been swallowed by the waves, but that island was called Slut's Bush, which I think is a crazy name. And then the widow runs aground near Wellfleet a little over an hour later. So, like I said, all 10 people aboard the Mary Ann, that's the cook, the first mate, and the captain's brother-in-law, and then 7 pirates, they all survive, and they make their way to Slut's Bush. On the widow, only 2 people survive. Everyone else drowns. Those are the carpenter, Thomas Davis, and a 16-year-old navigator named John Julian. And unfortunately, the young kid, John King, the 10-year-old, he also dies, and actually a child's bones were found in the widow. Initially, they were thought to belong to a very small person, but it was actually, there was testing done, and they did belong to a child, so we know what happened to John King. Anyway, yeah, so all this happens, they run aground. This is a part of the legend that has really evolved over time. You'll recall how I said that the cook, McConaughey, tried to steer the Mary Ann off course because he was afraid that he didn't want to be associated with pirate activities. In a later version of the story that was written by someone who was writing an inventory of Wellfleet for the Wellfleet Historical Society, it's actually, it's said that the Mary Ann tries to wreck on purpose, because he's not just trying to steer the Widow off course, he's trying to actually convince the Widow to follow him into a dangerous part. The Mary Ann, being a much smaller boat, can go closer to shore without wrecking, so he thinks, okay, maybe I can get a little close to shore and then the Widow will follow me, thinking that I'm leading him in a safe direction and will actually wreck. That could be what happened, but more likely that was just an invention of the writer for the Wellfleet Historical Society. An even more exciting version of the story is told by Henry David Thoreau, who I promised you would make an appearance. Henry David Thoreau, in his book about his memoir about Cape Cod, he tells a version of the story that I think is the best, in which the crew of the Mary Ann, while the 7 pirates are drunk on the ship's liquor, the crew takes a barrel of tar and they light it on fire and throw it overboard. So it's nighttime, remember. The Widow is following the Mary Ann by looking for a lantern that's hung on the Mary Ann. So what the Mary Ann's crew does in Thoreau's version is they snuff the lantern and they throw this barrel of tar towards the land, hoping that the Widow will follow that, thinking that it's the lantern, and then get wrecked on the sandbar. Really exciting stuff. No matter what actually happened, the fact remains that both Mary Ann and the Widow do wreck. And then meanwhile, Paul Scrape Williams, Bellamy's other pirate friend, he takes his own ship, which you'll remember is also called the Mary Ann. He takes that north to Maine, and he continues on as a pirate well into the 1720s. Okay, so actually go back one slide. Yeah, I want to talk about these 2 survivors, Thomas Davis, the navigator, and John Julian. So John Julian, there's not a lot of records about him. Not a lot is known about him, because it's believed he was a Native American, based on artifacts uncovered at the wreck of the Widow. He was likely of mixed Native American and African descent. And so the 2 of these survivors from the Widow, they stumble to the house of Samuel Harding, who shelters them, and then he goes to search the shore for valuables, because when a ship wrecks, especially a ship holding pirates' treasure, there's going to be valuables washing up on shore. Now, we know from records of the time that when the Widow sank, it sank slowly, and people could see the masts poking up at low tide for a long time after the wreck actually happened. Anyway, so yeah, there were the famous moon cussers, who were the people who would have gone down to the beach to collect all of the treasure that washed up on shore, sometimes from the pockets of dead pirates who were washing up on shore. And yeah, they did a pretty good job of scavenging everything. Next slide. Okay, so yeah, John Julian. In terms of what actually happens to John Julian, it's thought he was probably sold into slavery, maybe even sold into slavery to John Quincy Adams. In 1733, there is someone named Julian the Indian who escapes from John Quincy Adams and ends up killing the slave catcher who is sent to bring him back, and for that he is executed. And so that's believed to be what happened to John Julian. Next slide. Okay, as to what happens to the other pirates, you'll recall there are 7 pirates aboard the Mary Ann and 3 of the Mary Ann's original crew. They are all on the island of Sluts Bush in Chatham. So the 7 pirates on the Mary Ann, they immediately told their 3 prisoners to pretend that they're part of the crew. In case the authorities come by and say, whoa, okay, what's going on here? Definitely no piracy here. Right, imagine that your boat has been hijacked and then they say, okay, I need you to pretend that you're on my side, right? Of course they're not going to cooperate. McConaughey reports the pirates to the authorities, and all 7 of them get brought to the county jail. And then Davis, the survivor of the Widow wreck, also joins them on April 29th. So pretty quickly, of the 9 pirates who survived the wrecks of the Widow and the Mary Ann, 1 is sold into slavery, the other 8 are brought to jail. And then meanwhile, the crew of the Mary Ann, the 3 survivors of the Mary Ann, they get to go off and continue their life and testify against those pirates. Meanwhile, Captain Cyprian Southack from Boston is sent to reclaim valuables from the wreck, but by the time he gets there, it has mostly been looted. Next slide. Okay, so Cotton Mather comes back, never passing up an opportunity to really establish himself as a very important person in Massachusetts. He decides that, Cotton Mather, he's the evangelical, he decides that he is going to be the confessor to these pirates during their trial, and he's going to write a book about piracy and how horrible it is, and how excellent of a person he is for showing these poor pirates the light of God. And so what ends up happening is that almost all these pirates are convicted of piracy, and they are executed. 2 of them end up acquitted. Those are Thomas Davis, who was the survivor from the widow. He is acquitted because he says that the pirates forced him to be part of their crew, and people believe him. The other one acquitted is Thomas South, because he is polite, according to 3 captives aboard the Mary Ann. They say that he is polite and does not really want to be part of Bellamy's crew. The others are all hanged, and Cotton Mather writes this very lengthy, very verbose pamphlet that says, "The end of piracy! Piracy is done! Sam Bellamy is dead, his crew is dead, these pirates who survived, we've executed them all. No more piracy." Next slide. There it is. That's actually, part of the pamphlet, which I believe exists in Boston right now. Next slide. 2 weeks later, this guy shows up. His name is Blackbeard. You may have heard of him. Cotton Mather was very wrong about piracy being over. Something that's interesting about Blackbeard is he actually would have sailed with Sam Bellamy in Benjamin Hornigold's crew. Benjamin Hornigold being that pirate who Bellamy joined after he betrayed Henry Jennings. So Bellamy and Blackbeard would have actually sailed together, but Blackbeard was not Blackbeard at the time. He had not yet established himself as this horrifying man with a burning beard who goes and attacks ships everywhere. Okay, next slide. So Bellamy may be dead, but the legend does live on. And there is this character who shows up in Cape Cod folklore after the wreck of the Widda, who's called the Wild Man of Cape Cod, and is thought by some to be the ghost of Sam Bellamy, who's still wandering the shore looking for his lost treasure. He is mentioned, he's mentioned, I think, first in, his first formal mention is in Myths and Legends of Our Land by Charles Skinner, who is a pretty prolific American folklorist who was writing near the end of the 19th century. I'm going to read an excerpt about the Wild Man from Skinner's book. Can we go to the next slide? So Skinner says, "For years after Bellamy's pirate ship was wrecked at Wellfleet by false pilotage on the part of one of his captives, McConaughey, a strange-looking man used to travel up and down the Cape, who is believed to be one of the few survivors of that night of storm and of the hanging that others underwent after getting ashore. The pirates had money when the ship struck. It was found in the pockets of 100 drowned who were cast on the beach, as well as among the sands of the Cape, for coin was gathered there long after. They supposed the stranger had his share or more, and that he secreted a quantity of specie near his cabin. After his death, gold was found under his clothing in a girdle. He was often received at the houses of the fishermen, both because the people were hospitable and because they feared harm if they refused to feed or shelter him. But if his company grew wearisome, he was exercised by reading aloud a portion of the Bible. When he heard the holy words, he invariably departed." Next slide. "And it was said that fiends came to him at night, for in his room, whether he appeared to sleep or to wake, there were groans and blasphemy, uncanny words and sounds that stirred the hair of listeners on their scalps. The unhappy creature cried to be delivered from his tormentors and begged to be spared from seeing a rehearsal of the murders he had committed. For some time he was missed from his haunts, and it was thought that he had secured a ship and set to sea again. But a traveler on the sands, while passing his cabin in the small hours, had heard a more than usual commotion, and could distinguish the voice of the wild man raised in frantic appeal to somebody or something. Still, knowing that it was his habit to cry out so, and having misgivings about approaching the house, the traveler only hurried past. A few neighbors went to the lonely cabin and looked through the windows, which, as well as the doors, were locked on the inside. The wild man lay still and white upon the floor, with the furniture upset and pieces of gold clutched in his fingers and scattered about him. There were marks of claws about his neck." So that is the legend of the Wild Man of Cape Cod, as recounted by Charles Skinner. And this wild man, I think, to me really shows that Cape Cod was not ready to let Sam Bellamy go. They knew that his ship had wrecked, but they we love the idea of the richest pirate in history being a Cape Codder, and we really wanted him to stick around. Next slide. And so this story of the Wild Man of Cape Cod ends up crossing over with the legend of Goody Hallett. In 1812, which I read from earlier, the wild man actually ends up murdering Goody Hallett because she will not tell him where his treasure is. So, like the legend goes, in 1812 at least, that Goody Hallett, from her vantage point upon the dunes of Wellfleet, is able to see where some of the treasure is washing up. She takes it, she buries it somewhere. Sam Bellamy, the wild man, when he comes back, he says, "Where is my treasure?" And Goody Hallett will not tell him, and so he murders her. There's a different version of the story told in The Narrow Land by Elizabeth Reynard, which is that the wild man wanders to the apple tree, where supposedly Goody Hallett and Sam Bellamy first met, and he dies there, and then Goody Hallett later kills herself from grief. In some versions of the legend, there is no wild man at all, and Goody Hallett gets chased by the townspeople of Eastham or Wellfleet into the White Cedar Swamp, where she falls and drowns. And it ends up being called Hallett's Hollow. If you didn't know that, there you go. Supposedly in some version of the legend, she drowns there in the White Cedar Swamp. Anyway, the two of them become fixtures of Cape Cod's folklore. Whether Sam Bellamy's ghost actually does still wander the dunes of Wellfleet, no one can really say for sure, but it's clear that he is he's someone who's remembered, as is Goody Hallett. And that's where the legend more or less ends. Yeah, unfortunately, I wish that I had like a more like, wow, like this is how it happened, a more striking ending, but unfortunately the best we got is a couple different conflicting pieces of folklore. But I thank you all for listening to me ramble about pirates and witches.
Thank you very, very much.